I will try to recall my wartime feelings about the Royal Welsh Fusiliers. I used to congratulate myself on having chosen, quite blindly, this of all regiments. Good God! I used to think, suppose that when the war broke out, I had been living in Cheshire and had applied for a commission in the Cheshire Regiment. I thought how ashamed I should have been to find in the history of that regiment, which was the old 22nd Foot, just senior in the line to the Royal Welsh, which was the 23rd, that it had been deprived of its old title, the Royal Cheshires, as a punishment for losing a battle. Or how lucky not to have joined the Bedfords. Though the Bedfords had made a name for themselves in this war, they were still called the Peacemakers, for they only had 4 battle honors on their colors, and none of these more recent than the year 1711. It was a sneer that their regimental motto was, "Thou shalt not kill." Even the Black Watch, the best of the Highland regiments, had a stain on its record, and everyone knew about it. If a Tommy of another regiment went into a public bar where men of the Black Watch were drinking and felt brave enough to start a fight, he would ask the barmaid not for pig's ear, which is rhyming slang for beer, but for a pint of broken square. Then belts would be unbuckled. The Royal Welsh record was beyond reproach. There were 29 battle honors on its colors, a number only equaled by 2 other 2-battalion regiments. And the Royal Welsh had the advantage of these, since they were not single regiments, but recent combinations of 2 regiments, each with its separate history. The 1st Battalion, PG 118, of the Royal Welsh Fusiliers, had 26 battle honors of its own, the remaining 3 having been won by the 2nd Battalion in its short and interrupted existence. They were all good bloody battle honors, none of them like that battle of the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders, into which, it was said, they had gone with 900 men, and from which they had come out with 901, no casualties, and a band boy come of age, and promoted a private. For many hard battles, such as the Boyne and Aughrim and the capture of Lille, the Royal Welsh had never been honoured. The regiment had fought in each of the 4 hardest-fought victories of the British Army, as listed by Sir John Fortescue. My regimental history is rusty, but I believe that they were the Boyne, Malplaquet, Albuera, and Inkerman. That is 3 out of 4. It may have been Salamanca or Waterloo, instead of the Boyne. It was also one of the 6 Minden regiments, and one of the front-line regiments at that. They performed the unprecedented feat of charging a body of cavalry many times their own strength, and driving it off the field. The surrender at Yorktown in the American War of Independence was the regiment's single disaster, but even that was not a disgrace. It was accorded the full honors of war. Its conduct in the hard fighting at Lexington, at Guilford Courthouse, and in its suicidal advance up Bunker's Hill had earned it them. I caught the sense of regimental tradition a day or 2 after I arrived at the depot. In a cupboard in the junior anteroom at the mess, I came across a big leather-bound ledger and pulled it out to see what it was about. It was the daily order book of the 1st Battalion in the trenches before Sebastopol. I opened it at the page, giving orders for the PG-19 attack on the Redan fort. Such and such a company was desired to supply volunteers for the storming party, under Lieutenant so-and-so. There followed details of their arms and equipment, the number of ladders they were to carry, and the support to be afforded by other companies. Then details of rations and supply of ammunition, with an earnest Godspeed from the commanding officer. A sketch of the commanding officer was on the wall above my head, lying sick in his tent at Scutari, wearing a cap comforter for the cold. And the next entries were about clearing up after an unsuccessful attack, orders for the burial of the dead, thanks from headquarters for the gallantry vainly displayed, and a notice that the effects of the late Lieutenant so-and-so, who had led the storming party, would be sold at public auction in the trenches next day. In another day's orders was the notice of the Victoria Cross, awarded to Sergeant Luke O'Connor. He had lived to be Lieutenant General Sir Luke O'Connor, and was now colonel of the regiment. The most immediate piece of regimental history that I met as a recruit officer was the flash. The flash is a fan-like bunch of 5 black ribbons, each ribbon 2 inches wide and 7.5 inches long. The angle at which the fan is spread is exactly regulated by regimental convention. It is stitched to the back of the tunic collar. Only the Royal Welch are privileged to wear it. The story is that the Royal Welch were abroad on foreign service for several years in the 1830s, and by some chance never received the army order abolishing the queue. When the regiment returned and paraded at Plymouth, the inspecting general rated the commanding officer because his men were still wearing their hair in the old fashion. The commanding officer, angry with the slight, immediately rode up to London and won Pogga 120 from King William IV, through the intercession of some court official, the regimental privilege of continuing to wear the bunch of ribbons in which the end of the queue was tied, the flash. It was to be a distinctive badge worn by all ranks in reward for the regiment's exemplary service in the Napoleonic Wars. The Army Council, which is usually composed of cavalry, engineer, and artillery generals, with the infantry hardly represented, had never encouraged regimental peculiarities, and perhaps could not easily forget the irregularity of the colonel's direct appeal to the sovereign in the matter of the flash. The flash was, at any rate, not sanctioned by the Army Council on the new khaki service dress. Nonetheless, the officers and warrant officers continued to wear it. There was a correspondence in the early stages of the war, I was told, between the regiment and the Army Council. The regiment maintained that since the flash was a distinctive mark won in war, it should be worn with service dress and not merely with peacetime scarlet. The Army Council put forward the objection that it was a distinctive mark for enemy marksmen and particularly dangerous when worn only by officers. The regiment retorted by inquiring on what occasion since the retreat from Corunna, when the regiment was the last to leave Spain, with the key of the town postern in the pocket of one of its officers, had any of His Majesty's enemies seen the back of a Royal Welch Fusilier. The Army Council was firm, but the regiment was obstinate, and the matter was in abeyance throughout the war. Once in 1917, when an officer of my company went to Buckingham Palace to be decorated with the Military Cross, the King, as Colonel-in-Chief of the regiment, showed a personal interest in the matter. He asked, "You are serving in one of the line PG 121 battalions." "The 2nd Battalion, Your Majesty." So the King gave him the order, "About turn," and looked at the flash, and then, "About turn again." "Good," he said. "You're still wearing it, I see." And then, in a stage whisper, "Don't ever let anyone take it from you." The regiment was delighted. After the war, when scarlet was abandoned on the grounds of expense, the Army Council saw that it could reasonably sanction the flash on service dress for all ranks. As an additional favor, it consented to recognize another defiant regimental peculiarity, the spelling of the word Welsh with a C. The permission was published in a special army order in 1919. The Daily Herald commented, "Struth," as if it were unimportant. That was ignorance. The spelling with a C was as important to us as the miniature cap badge worn at the back of the cap was to the Gloucesters, a commemoration of the time when they fought back to back. Was it at Quatre Bras? I have seen a young officer sent off battalion parade because his buttons read Welsh instead of Welch. Welsh referred us somehow to the antique North Wales of Henry Tudor and Owen Glendower and Lord Herbert of Cherbury, the founder of the regiment. It dissociated us from the modern North Wales of chapels, liberalism, the dairy and drapery business, Lloyd George, and the tourist trade. The regiment was extremely strict on the standard measurements of the flash. When new army battalions were formed and rumors came to Wrexham that in, I think, the 18th Battalion officers were wearing flashes nearly down to their waists, there was great consternation. The adjutant sent off the youngest subaltern on a special mission to the camp of the 18th Battalion, the colonel of which was not a Royal Welch Fusilier, but a loan from one of the PG 122 Yorkshire regiments. He was to present himself at the battalion orderly room with a large pair of shears. The new army battalions were as anxious to be regimental as the line battalions. It once happened in France that a major of the Royal Fusiliers entered the mess of the 19th Bantam Battalion of the Royal Welch Fusiliers. He greeted the mess with, "Good afternoon, gentlemen," and called for a drink from the mess sergeant. After he had talked for a bit, he asked the senior officer present, "Do you know why I ordered that drink from the mess sergeant?" The Welch Fusilier said, "Yes, you wanted to see if we remembered about Albuherra." The Royal Fusilier answered, "Well, our mess is just along behind that wood there. We haven't forgotten either. After Albuherra, the few survivors of the Royal Welch Fusiliers and the Royal Fusiliers had messed together on the captured hill. It was then decided that henceforth and forever, the officers of each regiment were honorary members of the other's mess, and the NCOs the same." Perhaps the most legendary item was Thomas Atkins. He was a private soldier in the 1st Battalion who had served under Wellington in the Peninsular War. It is said that when, many years later, Wellington at the War Office was asked to approve a specimen form for military attestation, he had ordered it to be amended from "I, Private John Doe of the blank regiment, do hereby, etc., to "I, Private Thomas Atkins of the 23rd Foot, do hereby, etc." And now I am going to spoil the story, because I cannot for the life of me remember what British grenadierish conduct it was that made Wellington remember. And so here ends my very creditable, after 11 years, lyrical passage. I was, as a matter of fact, going on to St. David's Night. PG 123, to the raw leeks eaten, to the roll of the drum, with one foot on a chair, and one on the mess table, enriched with spoils of the summer palace at Pekin. They are not at all bad to eat raw, despite Shakespeare. And to the royal goat, with gilded horns that once leapt over the mess table, with the drummer boy on its back, and Major Toby Purcell's golden spurs, and Shenkin ap Morgan, the first gentleman of Wales, and the British Grenadiers, the regimental march past. I was going to explain that British Grenadiers does not mean, as most people think, merely the Grenadier Guards. It includes all regiments, the Royal Welch among them, which wear a bursting grenade as a collar and cap badge to recall their early employment as storm troops armed with bombs. In the war, the Royal Welch Fusiliers grew too big, this damaged regimental esprit de corps. Before the war, there were the 2 line battalions and the depot, the affiliated and flashless territorials. 4 battalions recruited for home service could be disregarded in spite of their regular adjutants. The 3rd Battalion, which trained at the depot, was a poor relation. Now more and more new army battalions were added. Even a 25th Battalion was on service in 1917 and was as good a battalion as the 8th. So the regiment, that is, consensus of opinion in the 2 line battalions, only tentatively accepted the new army battalions, one by one, as they proved themselves worthy, by service in the field. The territorials it never accepted, disowning them contemptuously as dog shooters. The fact was that 3 of the 4 territorial battalions failed signally in the Suvla Bay landing at Gallipoli. 1 battalion, it was known, had offered violence to its officers. The commanding officer, a regular, had not cared to survive that day. Even the good work that these battalions did later in Palestine, PG 124, could not cancel this disgrace. The remaining territorial battalion was attached to the 1st Division in France early in 1915, where, at Givenchy, it quite unnecessarily lost its machine guns. Regimental machine guns in 1915 were regarded almost as sacred. To lose one's machine guns before the annihilation of the entire battalion was considered as bad as losing the regimental colors would have been in any 18th or 19th century battle. The machine gun officer had congratulated himself on removing the machine gun bolts before abandoning the guns. It would make them useless to the enemy. But he had forgotten to take away the boxes of spare parts. The 2nd Battalion made a raid in the same sector a year and a half later and recaptured one of the guns, which had been busy against the British trenches ever since. As soon as we arrived at the depot, we Special Reserve officers were reminded of our great good fortune. We were to have the privilege of serving with one or the other of the line battalions. In peacetime, a candidate for a commission in the regiment had not only to distinguish himself in the passing out examination at the Royal Military College, Sandhurst, and be strongly recommended by 2 officers of the regiment, but he had to have a guaranteed independent income that enabled him to play polo and hunt and keep up the social reputation of the regiment. These requirements were not insisted on, but we were to understand that we did not belong to the regiment in the special sense. To be allowed to serve with it in time of war should satisfy our ambitions. We were not temporary officers, like those of the new army, but held permanent commissions in the Special Reserve Battalion. We were reminded that the Royal Welch considered themselves second to none, even to the Guards. PG 125 representations had been made to the regiment after the South African War, inquiring whether it was willing to become the Welsh Guards, and it had indignantly refused. Such a change would have made the regiment junior, in the Brigade of Guards, even to the Irish Guards only so recently formed. We were warned that while serving with a line battalion, we were none of us to expect to be recommended for orders or decorations. An ordinary campaigning medal, inscribed with a record of service with the battalion, should be sufficient reward. Decorations were not regarded in the regiment as personal awards, but as representative awards for the whole battalion. They would therefore be reserved for the professional soldiers, to whom they would be more useful than to us, as helps to extra-regimental promotion. And this was what happened. There must have been something like 200 or 300 Special Reserve officers serving overseas. But except for 3 or 4 who were not directly recommended by the battalion commander, but distinguished themselves while attached to brigade or divisional staffs, or those who happened to be sent to new army battalions or other regiments, we remained undecorated. I can only recall 3 exceptions. The normal proportion of awards, considering the casualties we suffered, which was about 60 or 70 killed, should have been at least 10 times that amount. I myself never performed any feat for which I might conceivably have been decorated throughout my service in France. The regimental spirit persistently survived all catastrophes. Our 1st Battalion, for instance, was annihilated within 2 months of joining the British Expeditionary Force. Young Orme, who joined straight from Sandhurst at the crisis of the First Battle of Ypres, found himself commanding a PG 126 battalion, reduced to only about 40 rifles. With these and another small force, the remnants of the 2nd Battalion of the Queen's Regiment, reduced to 30 men and 2 officers, he helped to recapture 3 lines of lost trenches and was himself killed. The reconstituted battalion, after heavy fighting at Bois Grenier in December, was again all but annihilated at the Aubers Ridge and Festubert in the following May, and again at Loos in September, when the one officer survivor of the attack was a machine gun officer loaned from the South Staffordshire Regiment. The same sort of thing happened time after time in fighting at Fricourt, the Quadrangle, High Wood, Delville Wood, and Ginchy on the Somme in 1916, and again at Puisieux and Boulecourt in the spring fighting of 1917. In the course of the war, at least 15 or 20,000 men must have passed through each of the 2 line battalions, whose fighting strength was never more than 800. After each catastrophe, the ranks were filled up with new drafts from home, with the lightly wounded from the previous disaster returning after 3 or 4 months' absence, and with the more seriously wounded returning after 9 months or a year. In the 1st and 2nd battalions throughout the war, it was not merely the officers and non-commissioned officers who knew their regimental history. The men knew far more about Minden and Albuera and Waterloo than they did about the fighting on the other fronts or the official causes of the war. PG 127-12. In 1916, when on leave in England after being wounded on the Somme, I began an account of my first few months in France. Unfortunately, I wrote it as a novel, and I have now to retranslate it into history. I will give one reconstituted chapter. On arrival in France, we 6 Royal Welch Fusilier officers went to the Harfleur base camp near Havre. Later it was to become an educational center for trench routine, use of bombs, trench mortars, rifle grenades, gas helmets, and similar technicalities. But now we did a route march or two through the French countryside, and that was all, except for fatigues in Havre at the docks, helping the Army Service Corps unload stores from ships. The town was gay. As soon as we had arrived, we were accosted by numerous little boys pimping for their sisters. "I take you to my sister. She very nice. Very good jig-a-jig. Not much money. Very cheap. Very good. I take you now. Plenty champagne for me?" We were glad when we got orders to go up the line, but disgusted to find ourselves attached not to the Royal Welch Fusiliers, but to the Welsh Regiment. We had heard little about the Welsh Regiment, except that it was tough, but rough, and that the 2nd Battalion, to which we were now attached, had a peculiar regimental history as the old 69th Foot. It had originally been formed as an emergency force from pensioners and boy recruits, and sent overseas to do the work of a regular battalion, I forget in which, 18th century campaign. At one time it had served as Marines. The Ups and Downs was the battalion's army nickname, partly because 69 is a number which makes the same sense whichever way up it is. PG 128 written. The 69 was certainly upside down when we joined it. All the company officers except 2 boys recently from Sandhurst and a special reserve captain were attached from other regiments. There were now 6 Royal Welch Fusiliers, 2 South Wales Borderers, 2 East Surreys, 2 Wiltshires, 1 from the Border Regiment, 1 from the King's Own Yorkshire Light Infantry. Even the quartermaster was an alien from the Connaught Rangers. There were perhaps 4 time-serving NCOs left in the battalion. Of the men, not more than 50 or so had been given more than a couple of months' training before being sent out. Some had only 3 weeks' training. A great many had never fired a musketry course. This was because the 1st Division had been in constant hard fighting since the previous August. The 2nd Welsh had in 8 months lost its full fighting strength 5 times over. The last occasion was the Richebourg fighting of 9th May, one of the worst disasters of the early part of the war. The division's epitaph in the official communiqué read, "Meeting with considerable opposition in the direction of the Rue du Bois, our attacks were not pressed." The Welsh ranks had been made up first with reservists of the later categories, then with re-enlisted men, then with special reservists of pre-war enlistment, then with 1914 recruits of 3 or 4 months' training. But each class had in turn been exhausted. Now nothing was left to send but recruits of the spring 1915 class, and various sweepings and scourings. The 1st Battalion had, meanwhile, had the same heavy losses. In Cardiff they advertised, "Enlist at the depot and get to France quick." The recruits were principally men either overage or underage, a repetition of regimental history, or men who had some slight physical disability, PG 129, which prevented them from enlisting in regiments more particular than the Welsh. I still have the roll of my 1st platoon of 40 men. The figures given for their ages are misleading. When they enlisted, all the overage men had put themselves in the late 30s, and all the underage men had called themselves 18. But once in France, the overage men did not mind adding on a few genuine years. No less than 14, in the roll, give their age as 40 or over, and these were not all. Fred Prosser, a painter in civil life, who admitted to 48, was really 56. David Davies, collier, who admitted to 42, and Thomas Clark, another collier, who admitted to 45, were only 1 or 2 years junior to Prosser. James Burford, collier and fitter, was even older than these. When I first spoke to him in the trenches, he said, "Excuse me, sir. Will you explain what this here arrangement is on the side of my rifle? That's the safety catch. Didn't you do a musketry course at the depot?" "No, sir. I was a re-enlisted man, and I had only a fortnight there." The old Lee Metford didn't have no safety catch. I asked him when he had last fired a rifle. "In Egypt in 1882, he said. "Weren't you in the South African War?" "I tried to re-enlist, but they told me I was too old, sir. I had been an old soldier when I was in Egypt. My real age is 63. He spent all his summers as a tramp, and in the bad months of the year, worked as a collier, choosing a new pit every season. I heard him and David Davies one night, in a dugout opposite mine, talking about the different seams of coals in Wales, and tracing them from county to county, and pit to pit, with technical comments. It was one of the most informative conversations I ever heard. The other half of the platoon contained the underage PG-130 section. There were 5 of these boys. William Bumford, collier, for instance, who gave his age as 18, was really only 15. He used to get into trouble for falling asleep on sentry duty. The official penalty for this was death, but I had observed that he could not help it. I had seen him suddenly go to sleep, on his feet, while holding a sandbag open for another fellow to fill. So we got him a job as orderly to a chaplain for a while, and a few months later, all men over 50 and all boys under 18 were combed out and sent to the base. Bumford and Burford were both sent, but neither escaped the war. Bumford was old enough to be sent back to the battalion in the later stages of the war, and was killed. Burford was killed too, in a bombing accident at the base camp, or so I was told. The fate of many of my comrades in France has come to me merely as hearsay. The troop train consisted of 47 coaches, and took 25 hours to arrive at Béthune, the railhead. We went via Saint-Omer. It was about 9 o'clock in the evening, and we were hungry, cold, and dirty. We had expected a short journey, and so allowed our baggage to be put in a locked van. We played nap to keep our minds off the discomfort, and I lost 60 francs, which was over £2 at the existing rate of exchange. On the platform at Béthune, a little man in filthy khaki, wearing the Welsh cap badge, came up with a friendly touch of the cap, most unlike a salute. He was to be our guide to the battalion, which was in the Cambrin trenches about 10 kilometers away. He asked us to collect the draft of 40 men we had with us, and follow him. We marched through the unlit suburbs of the town. We were all intensely excited at the noise and flashes of the guns in the distance. The men of the draft had none, PG-131 of them been out before, except the sergeant in charge. They began singing. Instead of the usual music hall songs, they sang Welsh hymns, each man taking a part. The Welsh always sang when they were a bit frightened, and pretending that they were not. It kept them steady. They never sang out of tune. We marched towards the flashes, and could soon see the flare lights curving over the trenches in the distance. The noise of the guns grew louder and louder. Then we were among the batteries. From behind us, on the left of the road, a salvo of 4 shells came suddenly over our heads. The battery was only about 200 yards away. This broke up Aberystwyth in the middle of a verse and set us off our balance for a few seconds. The column of 4s tangled up. The shells went hissing away eastward. We could see the red flash and hear the hollow bang where they landed in German territory. The men picked up their step again and began chaffing. A lance corporal dictated a letter home. "Dear Auntie, this leaves me in the pink. We are at present wading in blood up to our necks. Send me fags and a life belt. This war is a booger. Love and kisses." The roadside cottages were now showing more and more signs of dilapidation. A German shell came over, and then hoo, 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 bump, crash, 20 yards away from the party. We threw ourselves flat on our faces. Presently, we heard a curious singing noise in the air, and then flop. Flop, little pieces of shell casing came buzzing down all around. "They calls them the musical instruments," said the sergeant. "Damn them," said Frank Jones Bateman, who had a cut in his hand from a jagged little piece. "The devils have started on me early." "Aye, they'll have a lot of fun with you before they're done, sir," grinned the sergeant. PG 132. Another shell came over. Everyone threw himself down again, but it burst 200 yards behind us. Only Sergeant Jones had remained on his feet and laughed at us. "You're wasting yourselves, lads," he said to the draft. "Listen by the noise they make, coming where they're going to burst." At Cambrin Village, which was about a mile from the front trenches, we were taken into a ruined house. It had been a chemist's shop, and the colored glass lights were still in the window. It was the billet of the Welsh Company quartermaster surgeons. Here we were issued with gas respirators and field dressings. This was the first respirator issued in France. It was a gauze pad filled with chemically treated cotton waste, to be tied across the mouth and nose. It seems it was useless against German gas. I never put it to the test. A week or two later came the smoke helmet, a greasy gray felt bag with a talc window to look through, but no mouthpiece. This also was probably ineffective against gas. The talc was always cracking, and there were leaks where it was stitched into the helmet. These were early days of trench warfare, the days of the jam-tin bomb and the gas-pipe trench mortar. It was before Lewis or Stokes guns, steel helmets, telescopic rifle sights, gas shells, pillboxes, tanks, trench raids, or any of the later improvements of trench warfare. After a meal of bread, bacon, rum, and bitter stewed tea sickly with sugar, we went up through the broken trees to the east of the village, and up a long trench to battalion headquarters. The trench was cut through red clay. I had a torch with me, which I kept flashed on the ground. Hundreds of field mice and frogs were in the trench. They had fallen in and had no way out. The light dazzled them, and Peg 133. We could not help treading on them. So I put the torch back in my pocket. We had no picture of what the trenches would be like, and were not far off the state of mind in which one young soldier joined us a week or two later. He called out very excitedly to old Burford, who was cooking up a bit of stew in a Dixie, apart from the others. "Hi, mate. Where's the battle? I want to do my bit." The trench was wet and slippery. The guide was giving hoarse directions all the time. "Hole right. Wire high, wire low. Deep place here, sir. Wire low." I had never been told about the field telephone wires. They were fastened by staples to the side of the trench, and when it rained, the staples were always falling out, and the wire falling down and tripping people up. If it sagged too much, one stretched it across the top of the trench to the other side to correct the sag, and then it would catch one's head. The holes were the sump pits used for draining the trenches. We were now under rifle fire. I always found rifle fire more trying than shell fire. The gunner was usually, I knew, firing not at people but at map references, crossroads, likely artillery positions, houses that suggested billets for troops, and so on. Even when an observation officer in an aeroplane, or captive balloon, or on a church spire, was directing the gunfire, it seemed unaimed, somehow. But a rifle bullet, even when fired blindly, always had the effect of seeming aimed. And we could hear a shell coming and take some sort of cover, but the rifle bullet gave no warning. So though we learned not to duck to a rifle bullet, because once it was heard it must have missed, it gave us a worse feeling of danger. Rifle bullets in the open went hissing into the grass without much noise, but when we were in a trench, the bullets, going over the hollow, made a tremendous crack. "Pag, 134 bullets often struck the barbed wire in front of the trenches, which turned them and sent them spinning in a head-over-heels motion. Ping! Rockety-ockety-ockety-ockety into the woods behind. Battalion headquarters was a dugout in the reserve line about a quarter of a mile from the front companies. The colonel, a twice-wounded regular, shook hands with us and offered us the whiskey bottle. He said that we were welcome and hoped that we would soon grow to like the regiment as much as our own. It was a cozy dugout for so early a stage of trench warfare. This sector had only recently been taken over from the French, who knew how to make themselves comfortable. It had been a territorial division of men in the 40s who had a local armistice with the Germans opposite. There was no firing, and apparently even civilian traffic through the lines. There was an ornamental lamp, a clean cloth, and polished silver on the table. The colonel, adjutant, doctor, second in command, and signaling officer were at dinner. It was civilized cooking, with fresh meat and vegetables. Pictures were pasted on the walls, which were wallpapered. There were beds with spring mattresses, a gramophone, easy chairs. It was hard to reconcile this with accounts I had read of troops standing waist-deep in mud and gnawing a biscuit while shells burst all around. We were posted to our companies. I went to C Company. "Captain Dunn is your company commander," said the adjutant. "The soundest officer in the battalion. By the way, remind him that I want that list of DCM recommendations for the last show sent in at once, but not more than 2 names, or else they won't give us any. 4 is about the ration for the battalion in a dud show." Our guide took us up to the front line. We passed a group PG 135 of men huddled over a brazier. They were wearing waterproof capes, for it had now started to rain, and cap comforters, because the weather was cold. They were little men, daubed with mud, and they were talking quietly together in Welsh. Although they could see we were officers, they did not jump to their feet and salute. I thought that this was a convention of the trenches, and indeed I knew that it was laid down somewhere in the military textbooks, that the courtesy of the salute was to be dispensed with in battle. But I was wrong. It was just slackness. We overtook a fatigue party struggling up the trench loaded with timber lengths and bundles of sandbags, cursing plaintively as they slipped into sump holes and entangled their burdens in the telephone wire. Fatigue parties were always encumbered by their rifles and equipment, which it was a crime ever to have out of reach. When we had squeezed past this party, we had to stand aside to let a stretcher case past. "Who's the poor bastard die?" the guide asked the leading stretcher bearer. "Sergeant Gallagher," Di answered. "He thought he saw a Fritz in no man's land, near our wire, so the silly Baith, Fimth, takes one of them new-issue percussion bombs and shoots it at him. Silly B fifth, R aims too low, it hits the top of the parapet and bursts back. Deal, man, it breaks his silly Fing jaw and blows a great lump from his silly Fing face. Whatever. Poor silly B fifth. Not worth sweating to get him back. He's put paid to. Whatever." The wounded man had a sandbag over his face. He was dead when they got him back to the dressing station. I was tired out by the time I got to company headquarters. I was carrying a pack valise like the men, and my belt was hung with all the usual furnishings: revolver, field glasses, compass, whiskey flask, wire cutters, periscope, and a lot more. A Christmas tree that was called. These PG 136 were the days in which officers went out to France with swords and had them sharpened by the armorer before sailing. But I had been advised to leave my sword back in the billet where we had tea. I never saw it again or bothered about it. I was hot and sweaty. My hands were sticky with the clay from the side of the trench. C Company headquarters was a 2-roomed, timber-built shelter in the side of a trench connecting the front and support lines. Here were tablecloth and lamp again, whiskey bottle and glasses, shelves with books and magazines, a framed picture of General Joffre, a large mirror, and bunks in the next room. I reported to the company commander. I had expected him to be a middle-aged man with a breastful of medals, with whom I would have to be formal. But Dunn was actually 2 months younger than myself. He was one of the fellowship of only survivors. Captain Miller of the Black Watch in the same division was another. Miller had only escaped from the Rue du Bois massacre by swimming down a flooded trench. He has carried on his surviving trade ever since. Only survivors have great reputations. Miller used to be pointed at in the streets when the battalion was back in reserve billets. "See that fellow? That's Jock Miller, out from the start and hasn't got it yet." Dunn had not let the war affect his morale at all. He greeted me very easily with, "Well, what's the news from England? Oh, sorry. First I must introduce you. This is Walker. Clever chap. Comes from Cambridge and fancies himself as an athlete. This is Jenkins, one of those patriotic chaps who chucked up his job to come here. This is Price, who only joined us yesterday, but we like him. He brought PG 137 some damn good whiskey with him. Well, how long is the war going to last and who's winning? We don't know a thing out here. And what's all this talk about war babies? Price pretends he knows nothing about them. I told them about the war and asked them about the trenches." "About trenches," said Dunn. "Well, we don't know as much about trenches as the French do, and not near as much as Fritz does. We can't expect Fritz to help, but the French might do something. They are greedy. They won't let us have the benefit of their inventions. What wouldn't we give for parachute lights and their aerial torpedoes? But there's no connection between the two armies, except when there's a battle on, and then we generally let each other down. When I was out here first, all that we did in the trenches was to paddle about in water and use our rifles. We didn't think of them as places to live in. They were just temporary inconveniences. Now we work all the time we are here, not only for safety but for health. Night and day. First the fire steps, then building traverses, improving the communication trenches, and so on. Lastly, on our personal comfort, shelters and dugouts. There was a territorial battalion that used to relieve us. They were hopeless. They used to sit down in the trench and say, "Oh my God, this is the limit." They'd pull out pencil and paper and write home about it. Did no work on the traverses or on fire positions. Consequence, they lost half their men from frostbite and rheumatism, and one day the Germans broke in and scuppered a lot more of them. They allowed the work we'd done in the trench to go to ruin and left the whole place like a sewage farm for us to take over again. We were sick as muck. We reported them several times to brigade headquarters, but they PG 138 never got any better. Slack officers, of course. Well, they got smashed, as I say, and were sent away to be lines of communication troops. Now we work with the 1st South Wales Borderers. They're all right. Awful chaps, those territorial swine. Usen't to trouble about latrines at all. Left food about, and that encouraged rats. Never filled a sandbag. I only once saw a job of work that they did. That was a steel loophole they put in. But they put it facing square to the front and quite unmasked, so they had 2 men killed at it. Absolute death trap. About our chaps. They're all right, but not as right as they ought to be. The survivors of the show 10 days ago are feeling pretty low, and the big new draft doesn't know anything yet. "Listen," said Walker, "there's too much firing going on. The men have got the wind up over something. Waste of ammunition, and if Fritz knows we're jumpy, he'll give us an extra bad time. I'll go up and stop them." Dunn went on. "These Welshmen are peculiar. They won't stand being shouted at. They'll do anything if you explain the reason for it. They will do and die, but they have to know their reason why. The best way to make them behave is not to give them too much time to think. Work them off their feet. They are good workmen. Officers must work too, not only direct the work. Our timetable is like this. Breakfast at 8 o'clock in the morning. Clean trenches and inspect rifles. Work all morning. Lunch at 12. Work again from 1 till about 6, when the men feed again. Stand to at dusk for about an hour. Work all night. Stand to for an hour before dawn. That's the general program. Then there's sentry duty. The men do 2-hour sentry spells, then work 2 hours, then sleep 2 hours. At night, sentries are doubled, so our working parties are smaller. PG 139. We officers are on duty all day and divide up the night in 3 hourly watches. He looked at his wristwatch. I say, he said, that carrying party must have got the RE stuff by now. Time we all got to work. Look here, Graves, you lie down and have a doss on that bunk. I want you to take the watch before stand to. I'll wake you up and show you round. Where the hell's my revolver? I don't like to go out without that. Hello, Walker. What was wrong? Walker laughed. A chap from the new draft. He had never fired his musketry course at Cardiff, and tonight he fired ball for the first time. It seemed to go to his head. He'd had a brother killed up at Ypres, and he said he was going to avenge him. So he blazed off all his own ammunition at nothing, and 2 bandoliers out of the ammunition box besides. They call him the human Maxim now. His foresight's misty with heat. Corporal Parry should have stopped him, but he was just leaning up against the traverse and shrieking with laughter. I gave them both a good cursing. Some other new chaps started blazing away too. Fritz retaliated with machine guns and whiz-bangs. No casualties. I don't know why. It's all quiet now. Everybody ready? They went out, and I rolled up in my blanket and fell asleep. Dunn woke me about 1 o'clock. Your watch, he said. I jumped out of the bunk with a rustle of straw. My feet were sore and clammy in my boots. I was cold, too. Here's the rocket pistol and a few flares. Not a bad night. It stopped raining. Put your equipment on over your raincoat, or you won't be able to get at your revolver. Got a torch? Good. About this flare business, don't use the pistol too much. We haven't many flares, and if there's an attack, we will want as many as we can get. But use it if you think PG 140 that there is something doing. Fritz is always sending up flare lights. He's got as many as he wants. He showed me round the line. The battalion frontage was about 800 yards. Each company held 200 of these with 2 platoons in the front line and 2 platoons in the support line, about 100 yards back. Dunn introduced me to the platoon sergeants, more particularly to Sergeant Eastman of the platoon to which I was posted. He asked Sergeant Eastman to give me any information that I wanted, then went back to sleep, telling me to wake him up at once if anything was wrong. I was left in charge of the line. Sergeant Eastman was busy with a working party, so I went round by myself. The men of the working party, who were building up the traverses with sandbags, a traverse, I learned, was a safety buttress in the trench, looked curiously at me. They were filling sandbags with earth, piling them up bricklayer fashion, with headers and stretchers alternating, then patting them flat with spades. The sentries stood on the fire step at the corners of the traverses, stamping their feet and blowing on their fingers. Every now and then they peered over the top for a few seconds. 2 parties, each of an NCO and 2 men, were out in the company listening posts, connected with the front trench by a sap about 50 yards long. The German front line was about 300 yards beyond them. From berths hollowed in the sides of the trench and curtained with sandbags came the grunt of sleeping men. I jumped up on the fire step beside the sentry and, cautiously raising my head, stared over the parapet. I could see nothing except the wooden pickets supporting our protecting barbed wire entanglement and a dark patch or 2 of bushes beyond. The darkness seemed to move, and PG 141 shake about as I looked at it. The bushes started traveling, singly at first, then both together. The pickets were doing the same. I was glad of the sentry beside me. His name, he told me, was Beaumont. They're quiet tonight, sir, he said. A relief going on. I think so, surely. I said, it's funny how those bushes seem to move. Aye, they do play queer tricks. Is this your first spell in trenches, sir? A German flare shot up, broke into bright flame, dropped slowly and went hissing into the grass just behind our trench, showing up the bushes and pickets. Instinctively, I moved. "It's bad to do that, sir," he said, as a rifle bullet cracked and seemed to pass right between us. "Keep still, sir, and they can't spot you." Not but what a flare is a bad thing to have fall on you. I've seen them burn a hole in a man. I spent the rest of my watch in acquainting myself with the geography of the trench section, finding how easy it was to get lost among cul-de-sac and disused alleys. Twice I overshot the company frontage and wandered among the Munsters on the left. Once I tripped and fell with a splash into deep mud. At last my watch was ended with the first signs of dawn. I passed the word along the line for the company to stand to arms. The NCOs whispered hoarsely into the dugouts, stand to," and out the men tumbled with their rifles in their hands. As I went towards company headquarters to wake the officers, I saw a man lying on his face in a machine gun shelter. I stopped and said, "Stand to, there." I flashed my torch on him and saw that his foot was bare. The machine gunner beside him said, "No good talking to him, sir." I asked, "What's wrong? What's he taken his boot and sock off for?" I was ready for anything odd in the trenches. "Look for yourself, sir," he porch. 142 said. I shook the man by the arm and noticed suddenly that the back of his head was blown out. The first corpse that I saw in France was this suicide. He had taken off his boot and sock to pull the trigger of his rifle with his toe. The muzzle was in his mouth. "Why did he do it?" I said. "He was in the last push, sir, and that sent him a bit queer, and on top of that, he got bad news from Limerick about his girl and another chap. He was not a Welshman, but belonged to the Munsters. Their machine guns were at the extreme left of our company. The suicide had already been reported, and 2 Irish officers came up. "We've had 2 or 3 of these lately," one of them told me. Then he said to the other, "While I remember Callahan, don't forget to write to his next of kin. Usual sort of letter. Cheer them up. Tell them he died a soldier's death. Anything you like. I'm not going to report it as suicide." At stand to rum and tea were served out. I had a look at the German trenches through a periscope, a streak of sandbags 400 yards away. Some of these were made of colored stuff, whether for camouflage or from a shortage of plain canvas, I do not know. There was no sign of the enemy, except for a wisp or two of wood smoke where they, too, were boiling up a hot drink. Between us and them was a flat meadow with cornflowers, marguerites and poppies growing in the long grass, a few shell holes, the bushes I had seen the night before, the wreck of an aeroplane, our barbed wire and theirs. 1,000 yards away was a big ruined house, behind that a red brick village, oaky, poplars and haystacks, a tall chimney, another village, Haynes. Half right was a pithead and smaller slag heaps. La Bassée lay half left. The sun caught the weather vane of the church and made it twinkle. PG 143, I went off for a sleep. The time between stand to and breakfast was the easy part of the day. The men who were not getting in a bit of extra sleep sat about talking and smoking, writing letters home, cleaning their rifles, running their thumbnails up the seams of their shirts to kill the lice, gambling. Lice were a standing joke. Young Bumford handed me one like this. "We was just having an argument as to whether it was best to kill the old ones or the young ones, sir. Morgan here says that if you kill the old ones, the young ones will die of grief. But Parry here, sir, he says that the young ones are easier to kill, and you can catch the old ones when they come to the funeral." He appealed to me as an arbiter. "You've been to college, sir, haven't you?" I said. Yes, I had, but so had Crawshay Bailey's brother Norwich. This was held to be a wonderfully witty answer. Crawshay Bailey is one of the idiotic songs of Wales. Crawshay Bailey himself had an engine, and he couldn't make it go, and all his relations in the song had similar shortcomings. Crawshay Bailey's brother Norwich, for instance, was fond of oatmeal porridge, and was sent to Cardiff College for to get a bit of knowledge. After that, I had no trouble with the platoon at all. Breakfast at company headquarters was bacon, eggs, coffee, toast, and marmalade. There were 3 chairs and 2 ammunition boxes to sit on. Accustomed to company commanders in England not taking their junior officers into their confidence, I was struck by the way that questions of the day were settled at mealtimes by a sort of board meeting with Dunn as chairman. On this first morning, there was a long debate as to the best way of keeping sentries awake. Dunn finally decided to issue a company order against sentries leaning up against the traverse. It made them PG, 144 sleepy. Besides, when they fired their rifles, the flash would come always from the same place. The Germans might fix a rifle on the spot after a time. I told Dunn of the bullet that came between Beaumont and myself. "Sounds like a fixed rifle," he said, "because not one aimed shot in 100 comes as close as that at night. And we had a chap killed in that very traverse the night we came in." The Bavarian Guards Reserve were opposite us at the time, and their shooting was good. They had complete control of the sniping situation. Dunn began telling me the characters of the men in my platoon, also which NCOs were trustworthy and which had to be watched. He was going on to tell me just how much to expect from the men at my platoon inspection of rifles and equipment, when there was a sudden alarm. Dunn's servant came rushing in, his eyes blank with horror and excitement. "Gas, sir, gas! They're using gas! My God!" said Price. We all looked at Dunn. He said imperturbably, "Very well, Kingdom. Bring me my respirator from the other room, and another pot of marmalade." This was only one of many gas alarms. It originated with smoke from the German trenches where breakfast was also going on. We knew the German mealtimes by a slackening down of rifle fire. Gas was a nightmare. Nobody believed in the efficacy of the respirators, though we were told that they were proof against any gas the enemy could send over. Pink army forms marked urgent were constantly arriving from headquarters to explain how to use these contrivances. They were all contradictory. First, the respirators were to be kept soaking wet, then they were to be kept dry, then they were to be worn in a satchel, then, again, the satchel was not to be used. Publicus 145, Frank Jones Bateman, came to visit me from the company on our right. He mentioned with a false ease that he had shot a man just before breakfast. "Sights at 400, he said. He was a quiet boy of 19. He had just left rugby and had a scholarship waiting for him at Clare, Cambridge. His nickname was Silent Night.